Everybody, we're gonna get started in about 5 minutes, so please grab something to eat, grab something else to drink. If you need to use the restroom, it's just outside this door. Go to your right, you'll see the sign for the men and women's room. It's down one long hall, so we're about to get started. Thanks for coming.
I mean, I just went to the bathroom and I noticed.
So, yeah, Rockwell architecture engineers are the ones who rehabilitated this building. And so that big space at the end of the hall is all of their office. And upstairs, not above us, but in other areas where there's a second floor, they have apartments.
Oh,
Yeah. So actually, I think the access to the apartments is just down the hall a little bit.
I thought I saw loft 5.
Yes. So I think they rent them and they have Airbnbs. One of them is Airbnb.
Oh my gosh.
And then of course there's the restaurant at the end, that was a diner. But it's during COVID, and
I read something about that.
yeah. So this is all, with both of it is all.
That's good.
It's lovely. They're the ones who undertook all that. Well, I know it's very. Nice to see you too. George was up here, wasn't fine, I weren't there yet.
We found each other around anywhere, but there was and it took it this time.
All right, everybody, Shelley said we have about 30 seconds. So we're gonna stay on track, stay on time. Good evening. Oh, yes, I need the clicker. Hold on just a second. And they still. Thank you all for joining us tonight. It is so wonderful to be back in person. We're really thrilled that we could do this for this evening's preservation conversation. Our November talk by Dr. Jonathan Hancock, presenting the New Madrid earthquake 1811-1812, the Fall Foundation in Little Rock. I'm Tricia Blick, Executive Director of the QQA, and I'm joined by Shelley Stormo. She is our Membership and Events Coordinator. I also have some of my board members here tonight, so I'd like to recognize them. Everyone who checked in was checked in by Richard Steinkamp, and Chuck Clyde is in the back, so if you guys would raise your hands and say hi. And I think Ann Bella Bryan is on her way as well. So I always want to identify my board members so that if you have questions, you can ask Shelley or me or one of my board members. They can tell you about the QQA, tell you what our work is, what our mission is. Having deja vu all over here. You want to just advance to Shelley? Do that. There we go. The other thing I want to do whenever we do one of these talks is thank our donors, individual and corporate members. We're able to continue our educational programs in what have been most challenging times with your support. And you can find the list of our corporate donors at our website at qualpod.com. If you're not a member of the QQA and you believe in our mission, preserving Greater Little Rock's historic places, we invite you to join and support the work we do. Just go to qualpod.com to join for as little as $35 per year or to make a donation. And if you join or donate at the $100 level, you'll receive our Never, Never, Never Give Up t-shirt. This is our shirt for this year. This is actually going to be Jonathan's shirt as a thank you for speaking tonight, but it's a good sample. And we're trying to figure out what we're going to make our theme for next year. But we also have talked about doing a baseball cap, which was a gift for all the folks who volunteered for the tour of homes this year. So if you're here and you couldn't come to the volunteer party and were one of our volunteers, come and see me because I have a couple of these for me tonight. All right, you can go to the next one, Shelley. And also, before I introduce our speaker, just wanted to let you know that this program is on Zoom as well as YouTube Live, and we'll take questions at the end of the talk. So if you have any questions, if you're not on site with us, please enter those into the chat area of Zoom. All right, on to our preservation conversation tonight. I'm very pleased to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Jonathan Hancock. Jonathan Hancock is an associate professor and chair of the history department at Hendrix College in Conway, where he teaches courses in early American and Native American history. He's lived in downtown Little Rock since 2013 when he moved to Arkansas after receiving his doctorate from the University of North Carolina. I'm just going to put in a little bit of a side story here too. Jonathan is from Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and is associated with the Moravian faith. And my husband went to school in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And so we've been able to connect a little bit and hopefully will more in the future. And share some of those Moravian traditions. And I'm also going to recognize Devin, his wife, who's here tonight. And actually, Jonathan's parents are here from North Carolina, too. So let's all welcome them. And certainly, I would be remiss if I didn't say also he and his wife are residents of the Governor's Mansion Historic District and live in a lovely house downtown. So we appreciate that we have connected with them on many levels. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Jonathan.
There's a clicker. Okay, I'll point to you. Okay, great. Thanks so much for coming out. I'm really delighted to be here. And I'm especially delighted that we can be together in person. I haven't had the opportunity to be in person with folks to talk about this book since it came out in April. So that's particularly meaningful to me. And it's also meaningful to me because I live in the neighborhood. I moved to Little Rock in 2013 from North Carolina. My wife, Devin, and I live with our poodle in what's commonly known as Charles Marat's house. I'm sure everybody knows Charles Marat's house. It's also Veterans Day, and I want to acknowledge veterans on Veterans Day. I have some friends from college who are deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan, and they're always on my mind on this day. And I also want to acknowledge my parents, who I'm excited to have here from North Carolina. It's a rare treat to have them here in person to cross the Mississippi River and make that long trek on I-40 where I was born and where I now live, many hundreds of miles west of where I was born. So thank you again. Yeah, I'm just really excited to be here. Before I get started to talk about the book and to dive into history, I want to sort of ask you all this. And it might be hard to do that with the folks that are online, but has anybody been in an earthquake before? Oh, wow. What do you think was happening?
It sounded like an explosion at the Army base in Fort Ord. It was the Loma Prieta earthquake of 1989.
That was in California.
My driveway.
Yeah.
Trying to finish a remodel. And nothing was damaged.
Other folks, have you experienced earthquakes like in this region or out west?
In Washington, D.C.
Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
Was that the one from that damaged the Washington Monument?
Yes.
Yeah.
You were in almost on its way.
Yeah.
Floors are going like this.
So I experienced that earthquake myself in North Carolina, but the irony of that is that I did not feel the earthquake that happened while I was in a library looking for references to an earthquake. So that's the only earthquake I've ever really been through. But you know, the Washington Monument was damaged, and can people go up there now?
Cathedral.
Yeah.
It is good.
Yeah.
Yes, it's
Yeah.
good. Yes.
Other folks earthquakes nearby, or Alaska? Yeah,
Costa Rica
Costa Rica.
And upstate New York.
and Pennsylvania.
Yeah, but
Oh.
we were on the highway, that was the New York one, but we were on interstate highway, so didn't feel it.
We thought they were welcoming us to town because everybody was standing out on the street. And I looked at him, I said, what's going on? And it's where the office was, and I said, maybe somebody from the office is coming here for parade.
So, yeah, so the basic premise of the book is 200 years ago, a little over 200 years ago, everybody thought, what's going on, right? And how did people 200 years ago make sense of really unprecedented shaking in the middle of the continent at a really significant time on the cusp of the War of 1812. And I'm going to talk about how people made sense of it within a couple different nations. So within the United States, but also within Native American nations at the time. Sort of how they thought about the relationship between the environment and disorder in the environment, something that was really, as I said, unprecedented and scary. And sort of what they thought about the relationship between environmental disorder and what they saw as human disorder and problems, social problems at the time, right? And the other thing that's really interesting when we think about it, right, is that, you know, we're going through times right now that I think we'll always remember, right? And people 200 years ago, when they looked back on their lives, when they got interviewed by archivists and people did interviews with them, they cite these earthquakes as these really foremost experiences, right? Where everything just gets turned upside down, right? Where people kind of wonder, like, what's going on? What's the meaning of this? How is this connected to, you know, human order? Is it connected to human order and our interactions with the natural world? So I guess I'll do a point. I feel like a huge show that. So I want to cover 3 topics in the time that I have. I want to talk a little bit about experiencing the earthquakes, particularly experiencing these earthquakes near their epicenters in the Missouri field, right, which is not far from us in southeast Missouri, as I've come to know that's how it's pronounced. I want to give a short overview of what's in the book. And then I want to close by talking about a surprising archival discovery that I made about the earthquakes and the relationship between the earthquakes, the Quapaw Nation, and the establishment of Little Rock. So where we are today. So we'll close with the establishment of Little Rock. So first, to set the scene, I've got a short passage from the book that talks about the experience of being on the Mississippi River during the earthquakes. So dawn revealed that Mississippi River navigation manuals were useless. Islands were missing, submerged logs rose to the water's surface to block channels, and riverbanks had disintegrated. The New Orleans, one of the first steamboats ever to ply the river, was north of New Madrid during the first shock. Like many Euro-Americans west of the Appalachians awakened by the shaking, the crew first supposed that the den was an Indian attack. As the boat passed through New Madrid, crowds from the bank begged to be taken aboard. People in houses already had been swallowed, and they hoped that it would be safer to ride out the shocks while traveling downstream. Painful as it was, there was no choice but to turn a deaf ear to the cries of the terrified inhabitants of the doomed town, related the Voyage's chronicler. Even when the shaking subsided, trees and broken chunks of islands scratched at the boat's hull, making it difficult to sleep on board. was supposed to be a crowning achievement of technological innovation, a celebration of a new era in the integration of markets and people in a growing nation, instead turned into a solemn passage full of anxiety and terror. So one of the first, if not the first steamboat on the Mississippi River happens to pass just nearby the epicenters of this earthquake, right? So we have this sort of odd coincidence. And if you've ever heard, if you're familiar with the earthquakes, you've heard that the Mississippi River flowed backwards. And it did. I've got 4 or 5 different firsthand accounts of people's experiences of being taken upstream miles. And there's some really interesting web resources by earthquake researchers that talk about how that phenomenon gets created. It has to do with cracks in the riverbank and water rushing into cracks in the riverbank and carrying people upstream. It's also really interesting, and I'm not going to talk as much about this, but I talk about it in the book, to think about the ways in which if you're on the East Coast and you're reading about the Mississippi River flowing upstream, you're all of a sudden willing to entertain all kinds of other crazy stuff going on. And a lot of that crazy stuff at the time was misinformation. It was just people looking for retweets and likes in early newspapers at the time, right? It's people kind of craving attention. So there was this really pointed discussion about, were there volcanoes in Asheville, North Carolina at the time? People had to take that seriously because the Mississippi River was running backwards. I want to talk a little bit about experiences on land. So a bit away from the epicenters. And disorientation and nausea were the abiding physical reactions to the quaking. It seemed as if my bedstand was on a rough sea and the waves were rolling under it, so sensible were the undulations, wrote a preacher in Kentucky. Another settler in Kentucky claimed to reel about like a drunken man. From Northwest Tennessee, a correspondent with a naturalist in New York reflected on the earthquake's effect on both the body and mind of human beings. People had been deprived of their usual sleep through fear of being engulfed in the earth. Their stomachs were troubled with nausea and sometimes even with vomiting. Others complained of debility, tremor, and pain in the knees and legs, he related. And an eerie array of sounds and smells complemented rifts in the ground, sand blows and toppled chimneys. The awful darkness of the atmosphere, which as formerly was saturated with sulfurous vapor, and the violence of the tempestuous thundering noise that accompanied it, formed a scene, the description of which would require the most sublimely fanciful imagination, wrote a woman from New Madrid. So people at the time, they feel the ground shake, but they look up and they start thinking, there was this theory of airquakes at the time, like, is the air, is this the air moving or the ground moving? They smelled odd things. They looked at what they thought were astronomical anomalies. There was a comet that had traveled across the skies in the months preceding the earthquake. So they thought maybe the comet was hitting a mountain range somewhere, right? So all kinds of really interesting empirical observations that people gathered about trying to figure out what was going on at the time. Everybody kind of became sort of a citizen scientist. So there were 3 major timblers, right? The first one is in December 1811, followed by timblers in January and February, and aftershocks that lasted into the spring of 1812. Estimates these days by seismologists is that there were about 7 on the Richter scale. Those estimates have been downgraded more recently from like 8 or 9. There's a lot of lore about the earthquakes. One is that the Mississippi River ran backwards, right? Another one though is that it rang church bells in Boston. I don't know if anybody's ever heard that. So it probably didn't ring church bells in Boston. They were referring to Charleston, and somebody thought that that was, Charleston, a neighborhood in Boston, but it was Charleston, South Carolina. I'll give you a map here that approximates what I think is sort of the scope of the earthquakes. So this is, as I said, the scope of the earthquakes with a couple different sites from the book that were important for people's debates about the meaning of them. So as I said, this approximates the geographical scope, which is massive, right? From the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, from the eastern Great Plains to the Atlantic coast. And this massive scope offers the opportunity to consider how people across a huge swath of the eastern half of the continent understood, tried to make sense of this disorder. And there hadn't been earthquakes this strong in the North American interior since the Middle Ages, since the 12 or 1300s. So earthquakes in this part of the country have been rare, but because of their infrequency, people took notice and ascribed great meaning to them. Right, places that are much more seismologically active, people just kind of. There's interesting oral histories of Native people in what is today California. It's just kind of part of life sometimes there, even though sometimes it's a little bit more disruptive than that. This is a bad cell phone picture that especially doesn't look great under this sort of fluorescent light, but can you see a little bit of this wave?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So maybe everywhere I go, I think I see earthquakes or evidence of earthquakes. But this kind of cave drawing at Petit Jean State Park that depicts wavy lines looks a lot like cave drawings in California that depict wavy lines. So I think this is ancient people recording a seismological activity in this part of the country. We also have a record of seismological activity in this part of the country from about 3,000 years ago, where people built a mound, a ceremonial structure atop a fissure that was created by an earthquake, right? So there's evidence of seismological activity, and we can see humans from hundreds and thousands of years ago recording them and seeking to make sense of them. So on one hand, these are unprecedented in people's lifetimes. But what's really interesting is if you look at indigenous oral histories from people across the United States, but also in this region, it's not as surprising, right? So what we can do then is use these earthquakes to think about how various indigenous communities thought about what was happening, right? Because it's the case that Cherokees and Creeks, Quapaw people were more quickly able to summon traditions of inquiry into the natural world that their ancestors had passed down to them about what these meant. And there's always a tension, and if you think about kind of sacred stories and oral histories that various communities tell, there's always a tension with earthquakes as kind of part of the natural order, sort of things rebalancing themselves, or as signs of problems, right? Particularly signs of ritual neglect or imbalance. And what's interesting is if you think about it, in both indigenous oral histories and also throughout the Bible, right, earthquakes betoken mean certain significant things, right? So I like to show this map because it betrays a kind of Eastern bias from the USGS, right? They're really interested in everything from the Mississippi River east, and you might say the same thing about early American history, right? That everything kind of faces east, focuses on the Atlantic coast. And as I said, you know, as geology goes, so goes historical studies, right? We as a historian, we lose a lot if we stay pinned to the East Coast. So, and just as an aside, the account of farthest west I found is in the Eastern Great Plains, where Oto people, native people, were talking to U.S. military officials later in the 18 teens about what they thought the earthquakes meant. So that shows that at least that far west, people experienced the earthquakes. So what I wanted to do with the book was think about how the geographical scope of the earthquakes generated not only a geological record, but an archival record that aids a fuller understanding of North American history at this time. And in particular, earthquake interpretations and debate and disagreement about the meaning of the shaking are a window into the tensions between religious and political authority within nations. And within nations, including but not limited to the United States. So across Indian country at this significant time, right before the War of 1812, as the United States is becoming much more expansive. I'm not sure if anybody's familiar with the War of 1812. It's got a lot of different interesting theaters, but the punchline is American politicians want to seize Canada, which of course happened, right? But in the aftermath of the War of 1812, which by the goals of politicians at the beginning of the War of 1812 was this colossal failure, in the aftermath of the War of 1812, Americans are much more confident in the stability of the Union. They're much more patriotic. If you think about, you know, the Star Spangled Banner was written during the War of 1812. So these earthquake interpretations are, as I said, a window into tensions between religious and political authority, working out the relationship between politics and religion in different spheres. And I examine 4 places in particular where these tensions play out. Among Creek and Cherokee people and their nations in the Southeast, the movement to build an intertribal nation in the Ohio Valley. I'm going to talk in a second about Tenskwatawa, but you probably maybe heard of Tecumseh. He's a major player in this era. And what Tecumseh is trying to do in the Ohio Valley is rally Native people across tribal lines to join in an intertribal militant resistance against the United States. And he allies with the British, and that forms a partnership that really creates the Western theater of the War of 1812. So we've got Creek and Cherokee people in the South, intertribal attempts at intertribal organization in the Ohio Valley, and then the United States, right? And what's interesting is that across these places, you see kind of similar, despite the differences in the size, territorial size, the ambitions, the population sizes, we see similar dynamics playing out in terms of tensions between religious and political figures. In each of these places, there were leaders arguing about the need to centralize national political authority. And there were also arguments about the extent to which religious matters and religious authority should anchor nationhood at the time. So in all of these places, prophets decried the direction of their nations. And these prophets seized on the earthquakes, among other forms of natural disorder, to bolster arguments about divine disfavor with nationalizing orders, with human order at the time. So, I'm sorry, back one, yeah. So to give one example, I want to head here to Prophetstown. And Prophetstown was the site of the attempt at building this intertribal nation among Native people in the Ohio Valley. And this is where you may have heard of Tecumseh, and perhaps you've heard of Tenskwatawa, who's his brother. Typically, Tecumseh is regarded as the military leader and the diplomat of this movement, and Tenskwatawa is the prophet. He's called the Shawnee prophet. Has anybody heard it's always interesting, like sometimes people hear lore about the earthquakes where Tecumseh said he's gonna stomp his foot. Anybody ever come across that? Sometimes that's something that shows up as like hooks in books, which I didn't mean to rhyme, but that didn't happen, but I think I'm the first person to have found in 1808, Tenskwatawa talking kind of like an earthquake was going to happen 4 years later. 4 years before the earthquakes, he claimed the power to change the course of nature and said that a day of judgment would arrive when all the unbelievers shall be utterly destroyed. You can imagine that a lot of these prophetic leaders and religious leaders in the aftermath of the earthquakes are saying, I told you so, right? Like, I told you something bad was going to happen, right? They jump to the earthquakes to seize on and magnify their arguments, but this is a little different, right? This is the kind of thing that modern seismologists can't do, predict an earthquake 4 years before it happened. So this is one of those things where, like, when I read it at this archive in Massachusetts, I just kind of reared up, right? It's, well, how did that happen? And you know, I brought this kind of skepticism to this claim, but I think it's a major missing piece of understanding how it was that these Shawnee brothers were able to rally people to try to repel Americans and to ally with the United States at the time. So among Creeks and Cherokees and also in the United States, there were other prophets who wanted to bind religious and political authority tightly together to redirect the courses of their nations. And in each of these spheres, there were people that said that this was alarmist and opportunistic, right? That these prophets were kind of kooky, that they shouldn't be the kind of foundations for nations at the time, right? And as I said, these kind of tensions are working out themselves in Indian country and in the United States at the time. This is slightly clearer than my wavy iPhone photograph from Petty Jean, but this is a handbill that was published by the itinerant evangelist Lorenzo Dow. And Dow was a prolific preacher and author who warned audiences about the necessity of conversion. In this first paragraph, he talks about the shortness and uncertainty of time and the awful consequence of living and dying in sin. And I'm going to zoom in here to the bottom of the handbill where it says, you know, wars, pestilence, earthquakes, and famine, right? So in the United States, among evangelists, Dow is this unaffiliated figure who sort of travels around the Ohio Valley, travels all over the place, actually. You know, he's really seizing on the earthquakes among other signs that he says are those that show the need for people to take heed and to convert to Christianity. So another thing that the book does is argue that these earthquakes are a major but little known factor of the growth of evangelicalism west of the Appalachians. My graphs didn't transfer. That's too bad. I've got two graphs that show basically the way that conversions to the Methodist Church and to the Baptist Church skyrocket in 1811 and 1812, and then taper off. And these are places in Kentucky and Tennessee. It really reshapes the institutional structure of the Methodist Church at the time, because the Western confidence of the Methodist Church has to be split, I think, between the Ohio and Tennessee conferences. So these church books that typically just Baptist church books will just mark, you know, who joined, who showed up, who was drinking. You know, they're pretty.
What were they drinking?
Well, they're pretty focused on disciplinary matters and attendance matters. And you open up these church books, and all of a sudden they're saying, "What's going on here? All these people are joining our church. This is great." And if you, and some of these churches are still around, they write these histories of the church and they cast this era as this kind of golden age of the growth of these churches, right? So that's the case for Baptists and Methodists, not just kind of unaffiliated people like Dow. When church membership started to decline, preachers decried backsliders as earthquake Christians. Right? Because after March 1812, after the aftershock, so people stopped showing up, that itself becomes a kind of rhetorical tool that can be used from the pulpit to argue that people maybe had short-lived religious commitments. So the book ranges across various places and people and fields of historical inquiry to reframe early 19th century North America as a place where everybody wrestled with the possibility of connections between natural disorder and human affairs. And of course, our understanding of earthquakes has changed, but we're not so far removed from considering the ways in which natural disasters are related to human activity, right? Particularly if you think about human-induced climate change and the ways in which the earth has been speaking back to humans. So I think in some ways, we can find some of these kind of observations and sort of the mania that's created when people are wondering what's going on. In a lot of ways, we're going through this kind of experience ourselves these days. So we can find some, I think, kinship with people in just trying to figure out what's going on. But I think even when it comes to how they think about their connections to the natural world, we're not that far, right? Even though seismology is obviously very different these days. Okay, so I want to close with a surprising find, as I said, and indeed this was the title of the talk, so you're probably wondering what the first 2/3 was about. But thinking through the relationship between the earthquakes, the Quapaw Nation, and the establishment of Little Rock. So I traveled across that large swath of land that felt the shaking. And everywhere I went, from December 1811 to March 1812, dial into archives, finding aids and look for stuff. People are wondering what's going on at that time, right? They're generating a lot of archival material. So at a certain point, I needed to just stop and finish the book, right? Because I'm sure there's stuff that is still out there, right? But as a researcher, I wanted to find it all. And so we moved to Little Rock, and I had to continue my search. We lived so close to the archives near the Capitol, and so I stopped by to see if there was anything that addressed the earthquakes. And what I found was this paper trail that connects the first ever instance of federal disaster relief in the United States to the establishment of Little Rock. And the establishment of Little Rock came at the expense of Quapaw people and their territorial claims here. So in 1815, the US Congress passed what's called the New Madrid Relief Act, which was legislation that entitled owners of earthquake damaged land the ability to claim 160 acres elsewhere. So if you're farming in the Missouri Boot Hill and your farmland is messed up, because it was, you could basically take a certificate from the federal government and plop it down somewhere else. And this is significant, right? This is, as I said, the first ever instance of federal disaster relief in the United States. But these land relief certificates quickly became mechanisms of fraud and speculation. And ultimately, they became mechanisms of the dispossession of Quapaw people. Because US officials were surprised at the extent of damaged land claimed by settlers, right? Everybody goes in and wants to claim that they had 160 acres damaged so that they can plop down elsewhere, even if that wasn't the case. And US officials found forged and mistakenly assigned certificates. I will venture to say that the New Madrid Law, as it is termed, has given rise to more fraud and downright villainy than any law ever passed by the Congress of the United States. And if its claims are not immediately decided upon, will involve citizens of Missouri in endless litigation and trouble, warned one official. And he was right, because the federal government addressed land claims into the 1870s. Right? This created this bureaucratic mess where they were trying to determine the authenticity of New Madrid land certificates. And real estate speculators started buying up these certificates and trading in percentages of these certificates. And you can find these certificates down at the archives. And in particular, there was a consortium of land speculators from St. Louis that basically gathered up a lot of land certificates and plopped them down in central Arkansas. And the rising value of these land certificates started to increase territorial pressure on Quapaw people. So in 1818, the Quapaws ceded 30 million acres south and west of the Arkansas River. So basically the red in this map is what Quapaw people ceded in 1818 in exchange for this reservation land, as it was called, which was about 1 million acres. And in exchange for that land, they got the 1 million acres and they got what were called annuities, which were the promise of supplies to them. Anybody heard of the Quapaw line? So the Quapaw line, which starts at the Arkansas River downtown and is commemorated in the Riverfront Park and runs through MacArthur Park, is the line in 1818 that distinguished Quapaw and US territory. And so speculators started to claim title to the land that was just west of that line, right? We're on the Quapaw side of the line right here, but not far is the US side, which is today downtown Little Rock. And these land certificates start skyrocketing in value, but it's risky business because there's two different competing groups of land speculators who want to establish Little Rock. One group has purchased a hunting cabin from a hunter and argued through a preemption act, it was called, in 1814, that they were entitled to the land. And then the speculators from St. Louis claim that through that they have title to the land because they plopped down these land certificates. And these opposing parties lobbied the territorial courts and the legislature to acknowledge their competing claims to this land. And they also lobbied that this land be designated the territorial capital. So both groups agree that they want Little Rock to be the territorial capital, and they win, right? And then eventually both groups compromise and agree to split Little Rock between them for development. And the consequences of these machinations. So imagine, a lot of wrangling and then a flood of settlement just west of the Quapaw line starts to put pressure on the Quapaw people, right? They're hemmed into this smaller amount of territory. They're watching Little Rock take off from across the line. And they end up, as settlers flood in, ceding that reservation that's in blue. And they cede that reservation in exchange for land in northwestern Louisiana in another treaty in 1824. And they get to Louisiana and they're facing flooding and starvation. Some of them briefly returned to pockets of Arkansas before relocating to what was known as Indian Territory in eastern Oklahoma in 1833. So if you think about Native American history in the 19th century and the ways that Native people lost land, right? I think you often think about the Trail of Tears. You think about major removal campaigns. You think about major military battles and conquests and the cession of land after military engagements. And this is not the case of a major kind of removal order from the federal government. It's not the case of a major military battle or loss. There's a subtle but no less devastating and consequential kind of engine of dispossession going on here that starts with these earthquakes, carries through to federal disaster relief, speculation on certificates as part of federal disaster relief that push pressure on Quapaw people right here. So as I said, it begins with these earthquakes. It begins with these well-intentioned efforts at disaster relief and ends with Quapaw displacement from their homelands here in Central Arkansas. So I'm gonna stop there. There's a lot of different other aspects of the book. I have some copies of the book for sale, and I feel a bit like Lorenzo Dow, like itinerant Bible salesman. I bought copies of the book at the author's rate, at the wholesale rate, and I'm happy to pass those savings on to you. And give your books my John Hancock if you'd like.
Yeah.
I had to make a hand John Hancock earlier.
Yeah.
So what questions do you have?
It looks like we might have something up in the chat, Shelley, if you want to take a look at that. No questions? Okay, I'll ask a question. So the certificates, so you had property that was damaged during the earthquake. Was it 1-for-1? You had to lose 160 acres to get 160 acres, or if you had a 10-acre plot, you still got 160 acres, or how did that work?
So that was what US officials were wondering, because all of a sudden a lot more people were claiming land than they thought there was land at the time. And it was typically not farmers in the Root Hill whose land was damaged. There were people who would show up from St. Louis and say, I'll give you this much money for your certificate. And in St. Louis, they started amassing those certificates and moving them elsewhere. But as I said, these certificates, there's concerns from US officials, and you can see this in correspondence about fraud. You know, it's like fake vaccine cards, right? Like it's not that hard to do. And so, you know, there's all kinds of court cases that last for decades about determining the validity of these claims. So in some ways, you know, they bring these claims and they plop them down like they're playing Monopoly here. And they start lobbying the Territorial Assembly to designate this place as the capital and to honor their claims. But then there's another group of people that have bought that hunter's cabin, and then those people cut a deal and decide to go in together to develop Little Rock.
What made them choose Little Rock rather than going down into the Delta for farmland or Little Rock was already established?
Yeah, that's a great point. It wasn't, there are people in the audience that probably know the answers to that better than I do. It works as a site of trade. It's also the case, like, why didn't they all just, well, people owned land in the Arkansas coast already at that point. And if you've ever been down the Arkansas coast, it's fascinating, right? Because there are these foundations from like banks that were going up, you know, and then all of a sudden the river changes course and they move Arkansas coast, you know, is no longer the capital. But that's a great question, you know, in terms of like, what is it about this location that was appealing to people? I would imagine it has something to do with like a possibility for river traffic.
Well, I'm sure.
And trade. Yeah.
A trading area. I mean, the Little Rock, you know, is one of the marks where you export.
This is exactly.
So what would you say is about the ratio of records from an Indigenous standpoint versus records from the United States? I know you talked a lot about archives, and so I was just curious as to, most Indigenous cultures were oral traditions.
Mm-hmm.
So
there's like a whole methodology of reading records that are not generated by Native people, but about Native people against the grain.
Mm-hmm.
So in some ways, you know, mission records that I looked at among Moravian missionaries at Spring Place and where they established a mission in Cherokees, those are kind of like Cherokee records, even though they're generated by Americans at the time. But I was really surprised and interested and committed to wanting to elevate Indigenous perspectives here, in the sense that There's just a lot. And I didn't want it to be sort of a kind of show and tell of like, what a couple Native people were thinking, but the real story is in the United States. I wanted to be pretty rigorously comparative about nation building across these places. So, you know, I'd say there's probably 15 or 20 Native groups that address the earthquakes, or that address earthquakes in oral history, in one form or another. And the Quapaws have that on a tribal website. They've started to build up and make publicly available a lot more of their oral histories. And there's one about the earthquakes and about carrying out rituals to try to make the stick shaking stop.
Where is that picture? Where is it?
It's
Where?
I have to confess that I took this one off the internet. So it's part of like the sculptures riverfront park.
So I mean, that's not the actual, this is made up later. It's in the real line.
Well, it might be part of the line. So there's actually, you can find traces of the line throughout, from the river market through MacArthur Park. There are these like little stamps in the ground. And there's actually somebody did like a blog where they tried to follow the survey, and you could look up the old survey records and acknowledge the line. And I think it's really, it would be interesting and valuable, I think, as part of the civic culture of Little Rock to sort of do more to highlight that fact, right? Yeah.
So I have several questions. So Petit Rocher is a myth.
Petit Rocher.
The Little Rock.
I don't know much about the sort of lore surrounding that aspect of the founding of Little Rock. I do know that, like, you know, French traders were interested in this area. It would have been a place that they interacted with Quapaw people. So I kind of picked up on Little Rock at this moment after these certificates show up. So a little bit more about the earlier history is sort of beyond my knowledge.
Okay. That was another one. This is quite intriguing to me because in this country, I feel kindred with the Indians because their property was taken from them like it was from African Americans. So I'm not understanding, was the property actually the Quapaw Indians when the certificates were given? And so the certificates were carte blanche to just go take their property.
So they were carte blanche at that point to start filling up just west of this line. And you can imagine that a bunch of people rushing in to this area because it's been designated the territorial capital is putting pressure on Quapaw people in terms of how they trade and subsist.
But did they own the property, the land?
The Quapaw people?
Yes.
They did, yeah. So they were recognized.
Were they given compensation?
So that's what's really interesting is that, you know, treaties often where Native people lose land, they're often done under duress. They're often not compensated very well. So they got $1 million, right, for a lot of territory at the time. But they also weren't ever able to sell their land on an open market because there was a Supreme Court decision, Johnson v. McIntosh from the 18 teens. I won't make this too much like my history classes and Hendricks, but it prevented them from selling their land on the open market. So they had to take the rate that was being offered to them by the federal government. So they did get something often, but it often happened under duress and they weren't necessarily that well compensated. But those treaties were part of the US recognition of their right to exist. So those treaties are still held up by indigenous communities today as evidence of their sovereignty, right? So even when they're you know, forced to remove, in the case of the Cherokees and other Southeastern Indians, that agreement is made by the US government acknowledging their right to exist. And these tribal nations to this day will point to these treaties and say, this is why we should be able to do whatever it is we want to do on our land as sovereign people.
Well, as well, like African Americans are trying to get compensation for farmers and everything else that was taken from us. Can they now, the ancestors, try to get compensation for basically the taking of their land?
So there have been moves by the federal government over time to recognize the injustices, particularly of the 19th century. Sometimes those moves don't necessarily benefit the people they're supposed to benefit. So something called the allotment era from the late 19th century. But there's been, I think, a broader recognition by the federal government of the possibility of either compensating Native nations or of allowing them to raise revenue in particular kinds of ways, if you're familiar with casinos. And those opportunities have not been, equally available to other people who had land or labor stolen in the establishment of the United States. And the basis for Native sovereignty with these treaties is it's a kind of a separate sort of legal and diplomatic context, because enslaved African Americans existed within the United States, not as separate people outside of the United States. So there are a lot of kind of interesting connections to make in terms of thinking through compensation, but the scenarios are quite different in terms of how that would work and how that works today.
In regard to today's earthquakes and the possibility, the New Madrid.
Yeah.
I know my sister lives near Memphis in a town called Wynn.
Yeah.
And within the last, maybe 10 years, they have upon occasion said, dishes were coming off the wall. They were having some those kinds of tremors. And so do you have you looked into any of the movement as far as when this New Madrid
When's
might?
it gonna happen again?
Yeah.
National insurance salesman probably. If you all have ever heard of Reelfoot Lake, if you see signs for it in Western Tennessee, that was created by these earthquakes.
Yeah.
And there's a Center for Earthquake Research at the University of Memphis that tracks kind of minor shaking. In St. Louis in the 1990s, there was like a kind of self-styled prophet who said an earthquake was going to happen. And then they found somebody at a university that said, maybe it would happen. And then that took off as like, is the big one going to happen, I think, in the 90s. But what's really interesting is this area is a lot more seismologically active these days because of fracking, right? Particularly in eastern Oklahoma. And if you think about the interpretations that indigenous people had of in the book, I talk about earthquakes as a sign of impurity and disease. That's kind of what happens when you so in some ways humans are sort of creating these things, right? I said we kind of come full circle in some ways in terms of thinking about human environmental impacts.
I think the question is Zoom.
Yeah.
Do you know about the Cherokees from Eastern Tennessee that were in the area at the time? Where did they go after being cleared off?
I do. There was a group of Cherokees who had started to migrate into Arkansas at the time. And they found themselves like literally swamped in North Arkansas by changes in the land. And so they went west. If these folks are interested, there's a particular account by a Cherokee leader named Scott Quaw from the 18 teens, where he writes about that, but also has some really interesting kind of insights into linking Cherokee oral histories with what was going on at the time and talking about some major foundational figures in Cherokee cosmology that he references. He said that a horse had dust on its back and it was shaking the dust off of its back in the sky, and that's what was creating the earthquakes.
about it on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that title of the book? Oh, the title of the book, it's called Convulsed States.
If you want to pull that slide back up, we can leave it up there.
Yeah, the very first one.
Yeah, I want to present Jonathan Hancock with one of our never give out shirts. I think it's appropriate for this talk. And I'm also gonna give him one of our volunteer
Oh.
caps because I'm sure. There we go.
It's like that, it's been drafted.
That's right, that's right. Wapak Quarter Association. So that was fascinating, fascinating. And for those of you who participated in the preservation conversation in 2018, which was the celebration commemoration of that initial treaty, which of course we know was superseded by many, many other treaties and loss of much of their land. Carrie Wilson from the Papaw tribe came and talked to us a little bit about that. And so this just adds another layer to a very complicated story. But I have to say too, and other talks that I'm sure many of you have been to, isn't all real estate transactions in Little Rock complicated? Really, right? I mean, there have been so many fights and duels and you name it about property issues in Little Rock. And I shouldn't say this, but I'm going to. My brother-in-law is an Oklahoma Sooner. And so I was always kind of like demeaning to Sooners, but my God, we were kind of bad too, weren't we? I mean, oh my gosh, in the land grabs. So learn something every day. So thank you very much. So Shelley, if you want to roll up to our next preservation conversation, is going to be Shayla Albee, and she is with the Division of Arts, Heritage, and Tourism, and she's going to share us what is going on with the Butterfield House. And for those of you who are familiar with this house, it's over at Pinnacle State Park, over by the stables. And this is actually where John Gold Fletcher was living when he wrote his Pulitzer Prize-winning poetry. And of course, we've been talking a lot about him because of John's Wood, but this is also a very significant property. And frankly, we thought that this building would be restored by the time we were doing this talk next month, but it is not. But she can fill us in on a very, very interesting history about this property. Okay, slide to the next one. And it is gonna be, I'm sorry, it is gonna be virtual. She's not in a position to do a in-person talk, so that will be a virtual one, but we're hopeful that we'll be able to go back to in-person for 2022. And the other thing I want to, of course, snag you on is the holiday social that we're gonna be having on December 4th. So this is going to be a very interesting event where you're gonna have an opportunity to visit 3 private homes. And it'll be not exactly a progressive event, but we'll have 3 groups and they'll all just rotate around. And at the end of the night, everybody will join at the Governor's Mansion, another historic yet public home. And we will have cocktail, really dessert, champagne, as well as entertainment by the Rodney Block Collective and a silent auction. So we hope that you would like to join us. The houses that are going to be on the tour are the Empress, Partywork House, the Skull House, the Sam Skull House, and the Marshall House, and of course the Governor's Mansion. So we're really excited about that. So tickets for that event are $100 each, and you can get them online, or you can call Shelley, and she can set you up as well. So thank you all very much for coming tonight. It was so lovely to see you. We have one more question by Mr. Hancock.
So if we want to learn all the details that are in the book, and we want to take advantage of the author's discount, how much is that and how do we do that?
I think it's $18. Is that right? $18 and cash, check, or charge, or?
Cash check or PayPal. I don't have a
PayPal.
credit card machine.
And we have several copies up here. We don't have very many. So if you want one, we gotta get one. And
If we run out, talk to me because I can give you a promo code to get the same deal from the publisher's website. So I can get it to you more affordably than Amazon.
yeah, wonderful. We appreciate you so much, and thank you all for coming, and let's give another round of applause. And there's still some snack boxes, so everybody grab a snack box, grab something for your lecture.